This is a follow-up to my post on the Make Your Own Gear subreddit. Just want to give an overview of my tent for those who are interested in making your own, and then talk about some of the gotchas that I discovered along the way as I made this thing. So as you can see, it's pretty much a spec for spec copy of the duplex. By default, I've kind of set it up with about a 4-inch pitch on the ground. The corners, you can see, I should have staked at the bottom, but they're attached with shot cord back to the stakes back there. The floor, it's pretty heavy, heavier than I wanted it to be, probably overkill, but the nice thing is don't really need to worry about a ground sheet. This particular material is the Hex 70 2.2 ounce. Ends up being significantly heavier, which I didn't realize when I ordered it, because it has a polyurethane coating on it as well as a DWR finish, so it'll make a great tent floor, but a bit heavy. Those are my trekking poles. The mesh is the ripstop by the roll 0.5, number 3 zippers on the doors, number 5 zips, and you can see they're waterproof for the vestibules. Could have did the flap and Velcro thing, but thought that would work out well. This is 1.1 ounce silpoly for the tent outer, and just some mostly 1/2-inch webbing around here attached. Got some line locks in the corners. BCDs on the tie outs, because I have had issues with these rubbing through on other stuff that I've used over time, so I figured it was a bit of a preemptive durability thing. So yeah, 2 doors, really huge doors, which are nice. When you fully open it, you get like a full view on the side. The floor is 51 inches wide, which is wide enough for 2 large sleeping pads, which I like things a little cushy, which is why I decided to build this tent. That's also why I went for this heavy material, because just when I was ordering, there wasn't any XL wide material which I needed that was polyurethane coated for the floor. But yeah, that's the tent. You'll notice right here there are attachment points on the side of the tent, which I added later, but that highlights the reinforcement method that I used. So there was some issues with silpoly in the past that Ripstop by the Roll had encountered with a customer, where they had reinforced with a more durable material on the edge, and because of the different stretch rates of the material, it had started elongating some stitches, so they suggested a bonded radial reinforcement. So yeah, that's kind of the specs of the tent. It's pretty huge, which for most of the places I camp shouldn't be an issue, but it might be an issue for others. But that said, if you're making your own tent, you can make it whatever heck size you want. You could do 45 to 47 inches is pretty standard for inside, and that gives you size for 2 regular width sleeping pads. It's 90 inches long, which I could have made smaller as well, but it is what it is. Just gonna open up the tent so you get a sense of what's inside. So yeah, here's a quick peek on the inside. Put 3 little loops on the top. Don't really use those that often, but I figure if we want to hang a light or something, you could hang a guy line across there and make a little clothesline. Here's a good shot on the opposite side. I just used the Hex 70 fabric to fashion a little pocket for the trekking pole at the top. It gives it a bit of extra wear there, and the mesh just wouldn't be able to handle having a trekking pole rubbing up against it the whole time. So I'll talk a bit about how I assembled this. I started basically from the bottom up. So I cut out the floor and the mesh all 4 sides, and then did this attachment here on the bottom. This is just a flat felled French seam. It was easy to do on this side, and that's kind of the first gotcha, is this mesh is like really stretchy. So what I did is I used some just regular Scotch tape to kind of stabilize the hem, and I figured I'd stick it on, it would stabilize it, and then I can rip it off after the fact. But the problem was that particular, maybe if you got like dollar store Scotch tape, but the particular brand that I got, which was Scotch brand, was quite sticky, and actually started ripping some of the stitches out, which you don't see on this side, but you will see in some of the crappy stitches and hems that I did along the way. So yeah, I cut out the floor. These floors, I also took some thinking. Basically what I did is you cut out the dimensions of the floor, so 50 by 90, and then you add 6 inches. Here is the depth of the floor, and then 6 inches. So what you end up with is a little square, if you're imagining like a top-down view. And then that square, it was a bit tricky trying to figure that out, because the width of the square, you have to take into account the seam allowance, but then this is essentially just another flat-felled French seam along there. But yeah, this netting was kind of a pain in the butt to deal with. Eventually what I did is I went to using double stick tape. So yeah, that's the floor and the net, which was the first part. Then once I finished sewing all those together, I just kind of left it be, and that was another gotcha. This netting has a propensity not so much to fray, but to curl on the edges, which made it a pain in the butt to deal with after it kind of sat around and got brushed up a little bit. So yeah, then I moved on to the fly, the outer part. The first thing I did was these hems across here. And I was basically building from the bottom up. So this, you'll notice, this hem, if that'll focus, maybe on the inside, yeah. So that hem across here, right there, is the netting's directly sewed in. So what I ended up doing for these seams is I essentially, rather than figuring out which direction, try and get like a 3-layer sandwich for a French felled seam, I just did like a sort of a half felled seam, I guess. So basically what you do is you have this, you can see this flap of material right here. That's basically double the width of the seam allowance on the other side. What I actually ended up doing, just to make things easier, is everything had a 1-inch seam allowance, because I knew if I was doing a flat felled French seam, you're going to end up with a 1/2-inch seam. And then this one, what I did is just cut everything with a 1-inch seam allowance, and then cut it in half. So the part that was the mesh netting, and then this part of the fabric right here was so the part of the tent body here and the mesh was basically sandwiched together, had a 1-inch. So I sewed that all together along this seam once, which was this left-hand side here. Then cut this side from a 1-inch seam allowance to a 1/2-inch seam allowance, fold that over. There's lots of good tutorials on the internet for how to do a seam like this, but it did take me a little figuring out how to get the mesh layer sandwiched in here. So I thought that might be helpful. You can see over here, I was not careful in cutting one of the pieces and accidentally snipped through, so I added a little patch there. So once I got the 2 sides sewed on, so now you've got the body together with these floor pieces done. Now the fly is starting to be attached to the floor. Then I did the ridgeline. I cut all these pieces square initially, and then I created a template for a cat cut, and then did that. This is another flat felled French seam. I forgot to add the little loops on the top. So that was pretty easy. I just undid or ripped the stitches to redo it. Makes it look a bit messy, but you know, you live and learn. So then I went on to constructing the vestibules, which was pretty straightforward, to be honest. The one gotcha for the vestibules was this top seam here. So I added 1-inch seam allowance along this whole triangle piece, so all along there. So what ends up happening is the seam allowances are actually perpendicular to the face of the triangle, but then once you get up to the corner, you actually end up with a little bit of extra fabric. So what happened is I sewed this seam here, flat felled French seam again, and what ended up happening is I didn't account for this top part because it's being sucked in here. You actually end up with like a little lip of fabric at the top, and it changes the angle. So what ended up happening is it kind of curves in. So that kind of threw me for a loop. It's really hard to explain without it actually being in front of you, I guess. But calculating all the seam allowances and everything for these triangles was kind of challenging. And then of course when you actually get to sew this part, these two angles aren't actually the same, so they don't fold over flat, and it creates more bunching and stuff for the material, etc., etc. You can see the double stick tape remnants in there for where I sewed in the patch or the reinforcement for where the trekking poles are. So yeah, and then these zippers were actually really easy to do. I just created like really skinny 1/8 inch pieces of double stick tape, which you can actually still see right there. Taped that all in, and then did the zips there. I didn't end up figuring out a really good way to stop the end here. I could have actually got zipper stops, might have been a good idea, but yeah, it worked out all right. I mean, it works, but yeah, it was just kind of all right. So the other thing too with that I forgot to mention is when I did the floor, I mean, the actual order that I did this, I can't remember, but so these zippers were another pain in the butt, because you obviously don't want them to move. So essentially what I did, and there's a Cuban fiber duplex clone on Backpacking Light forums. I think you need to be a premium member to get it, but they kind of laid out how to do this. So what I did is I got a huge sheet of paper, actually taped it together to make it a big piece of paper, and drew out these arcs. So drew that out with paper on the table. And then initially what I did before I figured out the double stick tape thing is I put Scotch tape on so I could actually trace out that arc. And then I like pinned this like crazy and then basted it to the mesh. And it was just kind of a bit of a mess. And it was like ripping out the stitching and stuff like that. And the double stick, or not the double stick, the Scotch tape was getting gummy, so it would mess up the stitch, create a rat's nest, and I'd need to keep going. So this is the bad one. You can see a bit of remnants of the tape there as well. So that didn't really work out well, and I was like, okay, what do I do now? So then I did the other side just with double stick tape. Essentially what I did is I had a piece of double stick tape on this side and this side. Then I basically laid it down with the double stick over top that arc that I drew on the paper, which of course, because it's mesh, you can see through it. So yeah, on the other side, it turned out much better. The only thing, maybe I'll go around and show you that later, but the only thing is the double stick tape sticks through the mesh, which over time has started to dissipate, just as it's got like dirt and stuff on it, but it worked a lot better, and the seams are a lot cleaner, and I didn't have to worry about it like moving around, having it be basted, or having to take out pins and all that kind of stuff. So it just worked out a whole lot better. The other challenging thing too, which you can't actually see, turns out, so basically the way you do a zipper and this stuff is you sew the zipper, now it's not focusing. So you sew the zipper basically completely to the mesh first, on the outside edges, and then you cut the center line of the zipper in the fabric, and then what you would normally do is you'd fold it back. So like on this zipper, you fold the hem underneath there and then you sew over it, so you get this nice clean finish. It looks really nice. But on this, remember the curling that happens with the mesh comes to bite you. So basically what I did is I just sewed it down the best I can, and that'll be that. I don't think it'll fray, so and the stitching will be strong enough. So that it worked out okay. I love the huge doors. It makes it super easy to get in and out, even though there's a trekking pole right in the way. But yeah, the doors were definitely a bit of a frustration. Then just sewed some, there's a stop on the other side of this to make sure it doesn't go on the other side. This is just guy line for some zipper pulls. So yeah, once I got the vestibules sewed together, so basically this was all one unit at this point. So the whole zipper, this was stitched together, so it was the whole vestibule side. Then I went on to stitch these hems, and that was probably the most frustrating part of it, because it's all really long, straight hem, and silpoly isn't as stretchy as sil nylon, so this is 1.1 ounce silpoly, but it's still stretchy enough and slippery enough that when you try and pull things taut going all the way along the hem, I did it once and I was like, oh, this sucks, maybe I need to pin it better, or I used bulldog clips, tried all sorts of things. Because when you get to the end of the hem, having stretched one of the layers, you end up like an inch too long or an inch too short, so it was like super frustrating. What I ended up doing eventually, again, there's 3 layers. You can see there's mesh, then there's the vestibule door, and then there's the fly. So 3 layers. I had double stick taped the mesh and the vestibule door, and then I thought I could just clip on the top. But what I did is I ended up having to use 2 layers of double stick. So 1 layer of double stick from the mesh to the vestibule, and then from the mesh again, which is the middle sandwich layer, to the fly. And that ended up stabilizing the whole thing enough. And then this is another one of those not French felled seams. So I did the same thing. Both were an inch seam allowance, and then on the inner layers, which would be the vestibule and the mesh, I cut it down to 1/2 inch, then folded over the top lip here on the fly, and then did that. So the double stick, honestly, I ripped out this one seam twice, super frustrated, before I finally figured out that I needed actually 2 layers of double stick tape and had to actually go to the store, buy more, that sort of thing. So then the tent was almost done, which was great. So on one side I've sewed shock cord with a toggle, which is much bigger than I thought it was going to be on ripstop by the roll. Then I sewed a little loop to create this thing. So looks all right from this side, but this side here ended up being a rat's nest. I never figured out the tension settings that would make it actually work. So it was the end of the project. And I was already frustrated enough. So I just kind of left it. I'll make sure I seal it nice and well. Once I still have some touch up to do for the sealing, but yeah, so that's assembling the tent. Like I mentioned in the post, I had not actually sewed before, so this was quite a challenge, for a lot of different reasons. But yeah, designing it was hard enough, figuring out all the angles and making sure like there's enough mesh and all that kind of stuff was challenging enough, but having to learn how to sew on top of that makes it even harder. So, oh yeah, the other thing I forgot to mention, because it looks terrible probably. So, these corners, I figured it would be challenging because it meets in like 3 places here, so the mesh and the vestibule and all that kind of stuff. So I left sewing these corners with the mesh until the end. But of course they had started to curl, and it was like super frustrating again to try and figure that out. So what I ended up doing is kind of just budging together and rolling it all up, knowing that the mesh has enough give to it that it will work. Then I sewed a seam through it, and then that didn't really seem strong enough, so I just went back around and took some of my extra grosgrain and just went up the side here, which actually really strengthened it a lot. I'm glad I did it. And it looks nice from the outside. On the inside, it looks terrible, but yeah, that was that. But yeah, it's a couple of people asked, I don't know if they were serious or not, if they should do a tent as their first project. Definitely don't recommend it. But yeah, it was fun. So that's my duplex style tent. Ended up being slightly heavier than I wanted, but if anyone has any other questions about how I put this together, throw something in the comments and I'd be happy to help you out. Peace.